Okay, so we are learning about the graphs of trigonometric functions, and they are what we call periodic functions. The reason they are what we call periodic functions is that a periodic function is a function that repeats over and over and over. Kind of like you come to this class every other day, over and over and over, right? Okay, periodic functions, a part of the graph, specifically the domain, repeats infinitely many times, usually. And I can't spell it. Infinitely. I don't know. Okay, so we'll apply that to what we just did on the other note paper in just a minute. And you can just jot this down on the paper that I had you write on earlier if you want to, or you can write on your own paper, like a separate piece. I don't care, okay? All right. The next word I want you to understand is called amplitude. How many of you have heard the word amplitude before? One of you? Okay. The amplitude of a periodic function is half of the distance from the lowest point, which we call a minimum, to the highest point, which we call a maximum, correct? So if you find the distance between the minimum and maximum points on the graph, and you half that, that's called the amplitude. So you would deal with this in things like a physics class where you're dealing with things like sound waves or things like that, or you could even apply it to waves in the ocean. The amplitude of a wave is half of the distance from the top to the bottom. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the actual graphs that you were doing earlier. Okay, the next word I want you to be aware of is, do we want to do that today? Yes, we do. Okay. The next word we need to know is period. The period is the length of the part of the graph that repeats. So if you have a certain part of the graph that's repeating over and over, whatever the length, the x value, how often that repeats is called the period. Okay? Then we have what's called, frequency. Let's go ahead and talk about frequency. Frequency is 1 divided by the period. And it's basically, it basically means the number of repeats that happen in 1 unit, which is often a unit of time. It doesn't have to be, but the reciprocal of the period is the frequency, and the frequency is how many times does that graph repeat in a certain length or a certain amount of time. Okay, so like frequency would be number of cycles per second or something like that. It's frequency, and it's just found by doing 1 over the period. Okay. All right, last thing I want to talk about really fast is called phase shift. And phase shift in periodic functions is basically just a horizontal translation. And if you don't know what that means, it just means the graph moves. Nope. Horizontal translation is that the graph moves left or right. If it moves up or down, that's just a vertical shift. And that doesn't have a fancy name like phase shift. Okay, so those are just kind of some basic words you're going to need to understand for the graphs we're learning about today. Okay? So now let's go back to the page we were looking at a few minutes ago. I'm going to stop this at this point.